Here in a little bit, we're going to talk a little bit about the Universal Audio Apollo platform for a minute, and then we're going to have them do a little live demo for you. So, should be cool. So does anybody know, I saw a couple of hands that people that have Apollo interfaces, does anybody know what it is that sets the Apollo apart from any other interface on the market? And neither of you guys can answer.
I'd say like DSP loading there.
That's exactly right. Yeah, so the DSP. DSP stands for Digital Signal Processing, and basically what that is we have computer chips running inside these interfaces that allow us to host audio processing software plugins on the interfaces themselves instead of on the host computer. And so what that does for you is it doesn't tax the computer itself when you're running our interfaces and our plugins. Everything's taking place on our DSP chips so that your computer's free to do other things. So by doing this, we're able to achieve near zero latency monitoring and a lot of other cool stuff with it. As you can see here, you know, the sub 2 millisecond monitoring latency is a big deal. You know, we have a lot of different plugin titles. The big thing from Universal Audio is that we're doing analog modeling of, you know, analog equipment modeled in the digital domain. And Universal Audio goes to great lengths to model these things really well and very accurately, so that really what you're hearing in our plugins is as good, if not better sometimes, than the hardware itself, because plugins don't have any tolerance issues where capacitors go bad over time and all this other stuff, not to mention the ability to recall your settings and things like that. Some things are actually handled better in the digital domain. So that's really kind of what Universal Audio is all about from the Apollo standpoint, is working with this analog modeling software on our own DSP chips. We'll come back to some of this stuff. So every Apollo interface is going to come with this console software. And this console software is part of what allows us to use our DSP for zero latency monitoring and to record through the plugins in real time. So a big part of that technology is what we call Unison. And that is the preamp modeling software in the console app itself. And probably the best way for me to explain Unison to you is to show you a little clip of a video from Jakir King at Blackbird Studios in Nashville. And that should give you a good foundation of what I'm talking about so that we can get into this in a little more technical detail. So I'm going to go ahead and play a snip of that for you.
There's a part of me I can't find in my memory when I knew nothing but my mother's love. Now that same love lives here inside of me, and it's a pure love. It's a pure love.
Hi all, this is Gannon from Universal Audio. And today we're going to take a look at Apollo's award-winning Unison mic preamps and UAD plugins versus vintage analog hardware. We worked with Grammy-winning producer and engineer Jakir King and artist Jamie Lydell at Blackbird Studios in Nashville on a live version of Jamie's hit tune, Walk Right Back.
I wanna walk right back to love, right back to the beginning.
Unison is the preamp modeling technology that's found exclusively on Apollo interfaces. As you may know, the sound of a mic preamp depends on its input impedance, or electrical resistance. This has a huge effect on the sound of your mics. Modern preamps tend to use relatively high input impedances, designed to maximize the punch and frequency response of the mic. Classic preamps, on the other hand, often use lower impedances, which is a large part of their colorful vintage tone. Unison is the only interface solution that adjusts the input impedance and gain staging of the physical preamp, and when combined with expert software modeling, It delivers the dead-on sound of classic mic preamps from Neve, API, SSL, Manley, and more. And thanks to Apollo's built-in DSP, you can track through UAD Unison preamps in real time without latency, just like analog. For the session, we transformer split the mic inputs. This allowed us to compare our Unison plug-in emulations with Blackbird's Neve and API mic preamps. Jakir also used the LA2A, 1176, and DBX compressor hardware he normally tracks with, and then we duplicated the entire signal chain with UAD plugins. We matched the UAD plugin settings on the hardware as closely as possible and recorded both paths. You're about to hear how close Unison preamps and UAD plugins come to vintage hardware.
I'm backing down the outputs a little bit so I can drive the preamps harder.
Exactly. Yeah, so you're keeping the preamp nice and hot and then just bringing the output down there.
Yeah.
Cool. This will be great because in addition to getting the Unison tone, you're going to be able to get the tone of the plugins as well.
Yes.
Love that.
The kick and snare mics were a Sennheiser 421 and a Shure SM57, running through Neve 1073 hardware and plugins. On the overheads, Jakir used an AEA R88 stereo mic feeding API 212 mic preamps and 550L EQs, followed by 1176 compressors. To duplicate this chain in software, we use the API Vision channel strip and UAD 1176 LN compressor plugins. Here's an A-B comparison of the kick, snare, and overheads. On the bass, Jakir used a custom direct box and a Neumann U47 mic, with a hardware Neve 1073 preamp and a DBX 160 compressor on both inputs. Here's an A-B comparison of the bass hardware and UAD Unison tracks.
Yeah, I'm looking at the settings.
Pretty
They're
identical settings.
almost identical, yeah.
It sounds like the same thing to me.
I agree.
We're going to do a little demo of our own. So here's the console software that comes with every Apollo interface. And it is essentially a digital version of an analog console that's basically in the box. So for those of you that know about, an analog console, you've got a preamp at the top. You've got some EQ, potential insert point, sends, and then a monitor level essentially. So it's not all that different here in the software. Across the top is our mic preamps, followed by our inserts where we run our plugins. Then we have sends, and then we have our monitor fader. Depending on what interface is plugged into the system, console is going to automatically recognize the correct number of inputs and outputs. Right now in my setup, I've got an Apollo 8P, which is 8 mic line inputs, 8 outputs, and then 8 channels of ADAT. I also have an Apollo Twin that is essentially running as my monitor controller. The Twin has 2 mic line preamps, 4 outputs, and the ADAT input. In addition to that, the Twin has full-featured monitor controls. So I've got an artist talkback, artist talkback mic. I can actually run more than one set of monitors off of this. I can use the 3-4 outputs as an alt monitor, mono, mute, things like that. And then I have front panel control for my overall volume and my headphone volume. So I'm using the Twin essentially as a monitor controller for this session, but it could be a standalone desktop interface with 2 inputs and 4 outputs. And it's a very popular interface in the market right now. A lot of guys are using it, including Josh. So anyway, on this session here, we've got the 8 mic preamps from the 8P here, and then we also have the 2 from the Twin. Those are unused, and we're going to only use 3 channels of the 8P for this demo. So let me show you a little bit about what's going on in the signal chain. On channel 1 and 2, we're actually using the front panel DI inputs on this. Unison not only does preamp modeling, it also does guitar and bass, cab and amp emulation. So when you come in through your direct input on the front, you've got different options for the plugins that you can use versus when you're coming in via mic. So on channels 1 and 2, we've got Josh's guitar plugged into an A-B splitter over here. And so he can essentially switch between 2 sounds live that way, just like as though we had 2 amps in the room here. So on channel 1, we've got a Fender Tweed Deluxe 55 model. This plugin has a lot of really cool things going on. We've got 3 different speakers that we can choose from, tone control, and then instrument volume, and then the different inputs we can actually switch, for the sound of the amp. It's an identical model to what's going on in the amp. As Gannon mentioned in the video, the big deal about Unison is that it's a bidirectional communication. We have hardware control of the software. So for example, right here on the preamp knob on channel 1, if I turn that, I'm going to get gain control on that amp right there. You can see that moving there. And then the software itself is also controlling the input impedance and gain staging of that DI input. So you'll notice when if everybody's really quiet, and I click over here onto this one, you hear it click, right, in the interface. And so what that's doing is that's actually physically changing the gain stage and impedance characteristics at the analog level in the interface. So that's something that's totally unique to the UA, Apollo platform, and something that nobody else in the marketplace is doing right now. So it's bidirectional control. So you get an option of 1 plug-in in your Unison slot, and then you have an additional 4 inserts that you can run after that. So on his guitar channel, we're running a little bit of Fairchild compression, and then some API equalization as well. So then on channel 2, we've got a slightly dirtier sound, and we're using the Fuchs amp model. It's got 2 gain stages and some basic EQ. Some of these plugins are really cool. You can actually flip them over, and you've got other options kind of behind the amp, if you will. Things like high-pass, low-pass filtering, noise gate. You've got a tap delay that's built right into it if you want to just get that going right there without having to add another plugin. Feedback suppression, that kind of stuff. And then we even have recording chains. There's actually 100 different speaker and mic models that we've modeled as an option for this particular amplifier. So you can really tailor the sound pretty significantly right from this one plugin. Again, it's Unison enabled, so the impedance that Josh is feeling when he plays the guitar, the way that instrument feels is going to feel very similar to how a real amplifier would react and sound and so forth. And that's kind of what the Unison stuff is all about. Then as we go down the chain here, I've got a SPL Vitalizer there. That's basically kind of adding a little sheen and smoothing out the sound a little bit. Harrison EQ, and then the venerable 1176 compressor. So that's the 2 guitar chains. And then on the vocal, we have the classic Neve 1073 preamp, which is the same thing that Gannon was using in the video. Then we've got LA2A compression, precision de-esser, and then a Cambridge EQ for a tiny little notch where we were getting just a hair of ring, you know, because we're live here in the room. So, so that's the chain on the vocal. I do have one other plugin there that we're not actually using right now, but something that's unique to the Apollo platform and fairly new for us is Auto-Tune real-time. So we're able to run Antares Auto-Tune on this platform with no latency, which if any of you have ever used Auto-Tune, you know that it's got a lot of latency in the DAW, right? So this was an industry first. You know, we worked with Antares to put this together, and basically what this is a software version of the old hardware rack unit for Auto-Tune that was used live, you know, for years in concerts. And so we don't actually have that plugin enabled right now because Zariah doesn't need it, but it's fun to show that it's possible to do that. So below that in the mixer, we have the aux and Q sends. With the Apollos, basically the outputs of the Apollo can be used for a myriad of different things that you can configure in the preferences, in the settings of this console software. So I have us set up to be able to use up to 4 Q sends, which would be 4 separate headphone mixes for the artist. And then I've got, you know, I've got the ability to run actually 2 sets of speakers. We only have one in the room right now, but theoretically I could switch to alt monitoring here, and we could A/B different sets of speakers as well, all off of the Apollo here. So in addition to that, we have 2 internal aux sends built into this console for effects. And so the guitar is getting some of its own effects here. We've got a Galaxy Tape Echo plugin, and then we've also got a AKG BX20 spring reverb, which is a really cool, classic, old-school spring, and UA is the only people that have modeled this yet. Then on the vocal channel, you know, we've got 2 different AMS RMX 16 reverb units that I have kind of created a custom wet-dry blend between these 2 to get a fairly wet and kind of soupy vocal sound going. So you'll hear that here in a minute. So let me close those out. And so anyway, what's going on in the Unison preamps up here up top, that is a sound that is being committed to tape, so to speak. And what that means is that what you do there is what gets recorded into your DAW, right? And so that's what's really cool about these interfaces and sets them apart from other interfaces in the market, is that the preamps on these interfaces essentially can change flavor. You know, we have a lot of different preamp models that are available, and so you can change flavor on a channel-by-channel basis. You can't do that with any other interface in the marketplace. Below that, the inserts, you actually have the ability to either record those to tape as well and commit your sounds as you would with analog hardware, or you can just monitor them so that you're hearing that, but you're not actually committing to those sounds when you're tracking. And that's switchable just by simply going from UAD monitor to UAD record over here on the side. So I've got it set to record because I kind of came up in a way in the studios where I want to get what I'm hearing and go for it and commit it and move on. So we're kind of doing that here right now as well. Console, as I mentioned, you know, it'll automatically recognize the available inputs and outputs in the interface, but then within the settings, you can further tailor that within the I/O matrix to build your own custom I/O configuration. It's important that you do that because that's ultimately what gets pushed into Core Audio and then ultimately what gets pushed into Pro Tools. So channels 1, 2, and 3 here in our console are essentially the same as channels 1, 2, and 3 inputs in Pro Tools here. So In addition to that, I've set up these 2 stereo inputs, and what those are is actually the outputs of these aux channels, which is kind of a really cool feature because we can separately record these effects on their own stereo channels and then decide whether or not we want to use them in our final mix or not. It doesn't matter, but that way if you've got a thing going that you like when you're tracking, then you don't have to lose that, so you can actually record that as well. And so that's what we've got going here.